I'm Karen, and I'm here with Kelly answering your grief questions. So, we have a good one today, and I think this probably speaks to, again, the surprises that come up through this process where we have an expectation versus that reality. But this question is, why does grief hit just as hard every time, even when you're used to losing people?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an interesting question, and I have to think about it because not everybody I see has that experience, right? I think maybe sometimes that acute grief can feel very similar, especially when there's multiple losses, but then maybe longer term, that grief may look different.
Mm,
But maybe that initial hit of it, yeah, it does feel hard because grief is a normal, natural response to loss, right? And this is somebody that we cared about and loved, and now they're gone. And
yeah,
so, of course, it's going to hit us. And I think it'd be kind of sad if it didn't hit us,
yeah,
as hard. If we were just got to the point where we got so used to it that it didn't impact us anymore. I'm not sure
yeah,
I'd want that.
yeah, yeah,
As much as I don't like the feeling of grief and as hard as it is, it's going to come up. And I also think there's along with this question is sometimes what we call compounded grief,
mm,
where we have one loss, we haven't even really fully grieved that loss, and then another loss can happen, and then it can compound it. But I even think for other people, I know for me, to be perfectly honest, I'll go to a funeral and I may not even know that person so much, but then it triggers my own grief
mm,
and I get maybe emotional or sad for somebody that I really didn't have that connection with
yeah.
because I do think it can bring it back up, right? I think especially when we grieve one loss, we tend to re-grieve other losses as well. And so I think that's probably part of why it hits us so hard
Yeah.
because we are re-grieving those other losses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, let's face it, in other things in life, if we do them repeatedly, then we feel like we just get better at it or we become accustomed to it, whatever that may be. And this doesn't work that way necessarily. Now, I do try to remind people that when they have had multiple losses, that there's going to be different factors, in terms of the nature of the relationship, how it happened, where we are in life, what else is going on. I think it can be very confusing. And this is kind of opposite of the question, I guess, but like when there are two very different reactions, like to a mother versus a father, or vice versa, and people feeling kind of disloyal or unloving about that because one is harder than the other. However, the bottom line is that I think it is hard each time because of compounded losses, because I don't think it's something that we can or would want, as you said, to get accustomed to, because we don't want to become quite so jaded to life being that hard that it's just like, oh, this is what happens. um I think it's also, the fact that, like, we get tired of being a grieving person. The more losses that we're adding, then the more we do identify with ourselves as a person who experiences a lot of loss and who has grieved a lot, and it just starts to almost maybe become what feels like part of your identity. I know people who have multiple losses sort of see it that way. Now, on the flip side of this, I do try to remind people that if you have been through losses before, you probably had to acquire some tools and skills along the way to help you through it. And if you can draw upon those, if you can recall what some of those things may have been, I find people have a tendency to be like, I used to journal, I used to meditate, I used to do these things, and I loved it. I don't know why I stopped doing it. And it's like, well, we can, kind of start doing some of those things again, and they may help you again,
Yeah.
to some degree.
Yeah. So I have a question, and I'm curious because I talk a lot about not comparing losses,
Hmm.
right? I'm very mindful of that in grief groups, right?
Yeah,
Because some people feel like their loss is worse than somebody else's loss,
yeah,
and then they get caught up in that comparison. And I always say what we grieve, we feel at 100%. And so we can't compare. But do you believe that maybe there is what some people would consider their worst loss? So maybe somebody has experienced multiple losses, but one is more of their worst loss?
Yeah, I do, because people have said it to me. They've said like, I've lost this person, I've lost, but this, is hitting differently. And I think that's going to mostly be to do with how much that loss impacts your day to day, your daily routine. I always kind of use the word proximity, and whatever that person's proximity is to your life, the bigger impact it's going to have. And again, I think that's why it can be confusing. Like, I've had people who have lost a parent who maybe they weren't as close with, or lived at a distance, or they didn't talk to as often, or whatever, but then they lost a neighbor or a best friend that they spent all of their time with and talked to every day and had coffee with every morning, and they're devastated. And it's like, well, this is strange, because I didn't grieve that much over my father, but this I'm really struggling with. And it's like, well, let's take it in terms of context of the current impact on your life. And it is going to be more impactful for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like you said before, the nature of the loss, the relationship,
Yeah.
all of those things, those factors that may impact that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's why, I mean, we always have to take a look at what makes your loss unique, and what are the different factors, and from loss to loss, what makes it different. And again, also remember what time of your life you're in, what else you may have going on. Maybe if you have your own health issues. I mean, there's just so many variables that, again, we shouldn't be comparing ourselves to other people, but not even ourselves to ourselves, you
Exactly.
know? I
Yeah.
think that that's really important.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well,
Yeah.
thank you,
Okay.
Karen.
Yeah. Thank you, Kelly. And we'll see you for the next one.